Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The villagers in Nong Khai had learned long ago not to walk near the marshes after dark, but Som Khai had forgotten why, and by the time he remembered, it was already too late. He had been cycling home from his uncle's farm when his tire went flat along the muddy road that skirted the wetlands, and as he knelt to inspect the damage, he noticed something glowing faintly in the distance, bobbing just above the reeds like a lantern carried by an invisible hand. It wasn't fire, not exactly, more like the pale green luminescence of rotting wood, but it moved with purpose, drifting closer in silence. Somchai stood frozen, his hands still, gripping the bicycle, and he felt the air around him grow thick and cold, as if the marsh itself had exhaled. The glow pulsed once, twice, and then he saw the shape beneath it, a figure that seemed human but wrong, its skin stretched too tight over bone, its eyes hollow and filled with that same sickly light. It was watching him, and Somchai knew without understanding how he knew that if he moved, if he made a single sound, it would come for him. Somchai had grown up hearing the stories, the way every child in the village had, whispered by grandmothers during the rainy season when the mist hung low over the rice fields and the frogs sang their endless chorus. They spoke of the fang, spirits cursed by their own greed, men who had once been sorcerers dabbling in forbidden magic, seeking power and wealth through rituals that required sacrifices most would not dare to make. The herb they used was called phong, a rare plant that grew only in the deepest parts of the marsh, where the water never fully drained and the air smelled of decay. To consume it was to invite transformation, a slow and agonizing metamorphosis that stripped away humanity piece by piece until nothing remained but hunger and light. The sorcerers believed they could control it, that the ritual would grant them the ability to see the future, to manipulate fortune, to bend the world to their will. But the phong consumed them instead, hollowing them out from the inside, turning their flesh translucent and filling their veins with a phosphorescent glow that could be seen for miles in the darkness. They became wanderers, cursed to roam the marshes forever, feeding on the life energy of anyone foolish enough to venture too close. The old women said the fifang could drain a man's vitality with a single touch, leaving him weak and sick, his body wasting away over days or weeks, until there was nothing left but a husk. Somchai had always thought these were just stories meant to keep children from playing near the water, but now, standing on the edge of the marsh with that glowing figure drifting toward him, he understood that the stories had been warnings. Memories passed down because forgetting would mean death. He had moved to Bangkok for work 3 years ago, and in the city, such tales seemed absurd, relics of a superstitious past that had no place in a world of smartphones and concrete. But he had returned to the village for his mother's funeral, and the grief had made him careless, distracted, and he had stayed too late at his uncle's house, talking and drinking rice whiskey, until the sun had set and the marsh had come alive with things that should not be seen. The figure stopped moving when Somchai finally looked away, breaking eye contact as his grandmother had once instructed, though he couldn't remember when she had told him this or why it mattered. He gripped the bicycle tighter, his knuckles white, and began to push it slowly along the road, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground ahead. The glow did not follow, not immediately, but he could feel it watching, a presence that pressed against the back of his neck like cold fingers. His breath came shallow and fast, and the only sound was the wet squelch of his shoes in the mud and the distant hum of insects. He wanted to run, every instinct screaming at him to abandon the bicycle and sprint for the village lights that flickered far ahead. But something deeper, some ancient knowledge buried in his bones, told him that running would trigger the hunt, so he walked, one step at a time, his legs trembling with the effort of staying calm. The air smelled wrong now, not just the usual rot of the marsh, but something sweeter, like overripe fruit left to ferment in the sun, and beneath that, a metallic tang that reminded him of blood. He risked a glance to his left and saw that the glow had multiplied, 3 or 4 lights now, drifting in slow circles as if conferring, and the shapes beneath them were clearer, tall, and emaciated, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. One of them turned its head toward him, and Somchai saw its face, or what remained of it, the skin pulled so tight that the skull showed through in places, the eyes empty sockets filled with that terrible green light. Its mouth opened, not to speak but to breathe, and the sound that came out was like wind through hollow reeds, a low moan that made Somchai's teeth ache. He forced himself to keep walking, to not look again, but his hands were shaking so badly now that he nearly dropped the bicycle. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and the village lights seemed no closer, as if the marsh itself was bending space, trapping him in this nightmare. The first touch came when he was halfway to safety, a brush against his shoulders so light he almost didn't notice it, like a moth landing on his skin. But the cold that followed was immediate and sharp, sinking into his bones, and Somchai gasped, stumbling, forward. He didn't turn around, couldn't, but he knew one of them was right behind him now, close enough that he could hear its breathing, that hollow rattling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. His vision blurred, and for a moment he felt dizzy, weak, as if he had been running for hours. The bicycle slipped from his grip and clattered to the ground, and he fell to his knees, his hands sinking into the cold mud. The glow surrounded him now. 3, no, 4 of them, circling slowly, their movements synchronized, predatory. He could see their feet, bare and blackened, the toes curled and twisted, and he realized with a jolt of terror that they were standing on the surface of the water, not sinking, not even disturbing the algae that coated the marsh. One of them leaned down, its face inches from his, and Somchai could see the veins beneath its translucent skin, glowing with that sickly light, pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. It reached out a hand, skeletal, fingers extending toward his chest, and he felt a pull, not physical but deeper, as if something inside him was being drawn out, sucked toward the creature like water down a drain. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, fragmented and faint, something about salt, about iron, about speaking the name of the Buddha, but he couldn't form the words. His mouth was too dry, his tongue too heavy. The fang tilted its head, curious, and its mouth opened wider, revealing a throat that glowed from within, and Somchai understood that it was going to feed, that it had been waiting here, in this exact spot, for someone like him, someone who had forgotten the rules. The sound of a motorcycle engine shattered the silence, a sudden roar that cut through the marsh like a blade, and the fang recoiled, their heads snapping toward the source of the noise. Headlights pierced the darkness, bright and harsh, and Somchai heard a voice shouting his name, his uncle's voice, rough and panicked. The creatures hissed, a sound like steam escaping from a kettle, and they retreated into the reeds, their glow fading but not disappearing, merely withdrawing to a safer distance. His uncle's motorcycle skidded to a stop beside him, and strong hands grabbed Somchai under the arms, hauling him upright. His uncle was muttering prayers under his breath, old words in a dialect Somchai didn't fully understand, and he pressed something into Somchai's palm, a small cloth pouch that smelled of herbs and smoke. They didn't speak. There was no time. His uncle simply threw Somchai onto the back of the motorcycle and gunned the engine, and they sped away from the marsh, leaving the bicycle behind. Somchai clung to his uncle's back, his body trembling uncontrollably, and he looked over his shoulder just once, long enough to see the glowing figures standing at the edge of the road, watching them go, patient and eternal. When they reached the village, his uncle took him straight to the house of the old monk who lived near the temple, and the monk listened to Somchai's stammering account without interruption, his face grave. He examined Somchai carefully, checking his pulse, looking into his eyes, and then he nodded slowly and said that Somchai had been lucky, that the fang had only just begun to feed, that a few more seconds and he would have been lost. The monk prepared a mixture of holy water and ground herbs, which he made Somchai drink, and then he chanted over him for hours, his voice low and rhythmic, until the sun began to rise and the world felt normal again, or almost normal. But Somchai was never the same after that night, and everyone in the village could see it. He grew thin and pale over the following weeks, his appetite vanishing, his sleep plagued by dreams of glowing eyes and cold hands. The monk visited him several times, performing more rituals, burning incense and sprinkling blessed water around his bed, but the weakness lingered, a dull ache that settled into his bones. His uncle explained, reluctantly, that the fang had taken something from him, not much, but enough to leave a mark, a vulnerability that would take months or even years to heal, if it healed at all. Somchai asked why the creatures existed, why anyone would choose to become such a thing, and his uncle told him the old story, the full version, the one that was too dark for children. There had been a time, generations ago, when powerful sorcerers in the region practiced the fang ritual openly, believing it was the ultimate path to enlightenment and control. They would fast for weeks, purifying their bodies, and then consume the herb in a ceremony held deep in the marsh, surrounded by offerings and protective charms. The transformation was supposed to be temporary, a way to glimpse the spirit world and return with knowledge and power. But the herb was more potent than they understood, and it did not merely open a door to the other side. It pulled them through, trapping them between life and death, neither fully human nor fully spirit. The sorcerers who underwent the ritual found themselves unable to return to their old lives, their bodies no longer capable of processing normal food, their minds consumed by an insatiable hunger for the life force of others. They became parasites, feeding on the vitality of the living to sustain their cursed existence, and over time they forgot who they had been, their identities dissolving into the glow that animated their hollow forms. The marsh became their domain, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin, and they waited there, patient and endless, for anyone who strayed too close. His uncle said that some believed the fang were not entirely mindless, that deep within the glow, fragments of the original sorcerer's consciousness remained, trapped and suffering, aware of what they had become, but powerless to stop it. Somchai shuddered at the thought, imagining an eternity spent as a predator, unable to die, unable to rest, forever hungry. He asked if there was any way to free them, to break the curse, and his uncle shook his head. The ritual that created them was irreversible. The only mercy was avoidance, leaving them to the marsh, never feeding their hunger, never giving them a reason to wander closer to the living world. Somchai left the village a month later, returning to Bangkok, but he carried the memory with him like a scar. He avoided marshes, avoided the countryside at night, avoided anything that reminded him of that terrible glow. He told no one in the city what had happened, knowing they would laugh or dismiss it as a hallucination brought on by grief and alcohol. But he knew the truth. He had felt the cold touch of the phong, had looked into those empty, glowing eyes, and he understood that there were things in the world that existed beyond explanation, beyond control. Things that waited in the dark places for the unwary and the forgetful. Sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he would stand by his apartment window and look out at the city lights, and he would wonder if the phong were still out there in the marsh, still glowing, still waiting, and if somewhere another traveler had forgotten the old warnings and was about to remember why the villagers never walked near the water after dark. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The cursed spirits of the marsh are not the only remnants of forbidden magic that haunt the dark corners of Asia. There are rituals even more sinister, practices that do not merely transform the living into something monstrous, but instead bind the dead to the will of the ambitious and the desperate. In another part of Thailand, a different kind of darkness thrives, one that requires not herbs or transformation, but something far more grotesque, the desecration of the dead and the extraction of their essence. This is a story about greed, about the terrible price of using spirits as tools, and about what happens when those spirits decide they will no longer be enslaved. Niran had been warned about the oil, but desperation has a way of erasing caution, and when his business failed for the third time in as many years, when his wife threatened to leave and take their daughter with her, when the debts piled so high he could barely breathe, he found himself standing in front of a door he had sworn he would never open. The door belonged to a man named Kun Prasart, a practitioner of what the locals called Sayasart, a form of magic that blended old animist beliefs with Buddhist rituals. Though the monks would have denied any connection, Prasart's house sat at the end of a narrow alley in the old district of Chiang Mai, a place where tourists rarely ventured and where the neighbors kept their heads down and their doors locked. Niran had heard about Prasart from a former business associate who had experienced a similar run of bad luck, only to turn everything around after a single visit to the sorcerer. The associate had been vague about the details, speaking only of powerful protections and blessings that brought wealth and opportunity, but Niran had seen the fear in the man's eyes when he talked about it. A fear mixed with something else, something that looked almost like guilt. Niran knocked on the door 3 times, and when it opened, Prasart stood there, older than Niran had expected, his face lined and weathered, his eyes sharp and calculating. He looked at Niran for a long moment, as if weighing him, and then stepped aside without a word, gesturing for Niran to enter. The interior of the house was dimly lit, the air thick with incense and something else, a smell that reminded Niran of hospitals, antiseptic and faintly sweet. The walls were covered with amulets and talismans, rows of small Buddha statues, yellowed photographs of monks and other objects Niran couldn't identify, small bottles filled with dark liquid, bundles of dried herbs, and what looked like pieces of bone arranged in careful patterns. Prasart led him to a small room at the back of the house, where a low table sat surrounded by cushions, and he gestured for Niran to sit. He asked Niran why he had come, and Niran told him everything, the failed businesses, the mounting debt, the feeling that he was cursed, that no matter what he tried, nothing worked. Prasart listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, and when Niran finished, the old man nodded slowly and said that, yes, Niran was indeed cursed, but not in the way he thought. It was not a spell cast by an enemy or bad karma from a past life. It was simply the absence of protection, a vulnerability that allowed misfortune to cling to him like a shadow. Prasert said he could fix this, that he had helped many men in Niran's position. But the solution was not simple or cheap, and it required absolute trust and commitment. Niran asked what he meant, and Prasert leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, and said that he would provide Niran with man prai, an oil extracted from corpses, specifically from those who had died violently or tragically, whose spirits remained bound to the physical world, restless and powerful. This oil, when blessed and consecrated properly, could bring wealth, attract love, protect against enemies, and turn luck in the user's favor. But it was not a toy, Prasert warned. It was a partnership with the dead, and the spirit within the oil demanded respect, offerings, and care. If Niran failed to honor the spirit, if he grew careless or greedy, the consequences would be severe. Niran felt a chill run through him, but he was too desperate to walk away, and he asked how much it would cost. Prasert quoted a price that made Niran wince, but it was less than his debts, and the old man offered a payment plan, which Niran accepted after only a moment's hesitation. Prasert disappeared into another room and returned a few minutes later, carrying a small glass vial no larger than Niran's thumb, filled with a clear, slightly yellowish liquid that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. He placed it on the table between them and began to explain the rules. Niran was to keep the oil with him at all times, in his pocket or around his neck, and he was to make offerings to the spirit every week, a small bowl of rice, fruit, flowers, and a stick of incense, placed in a quiet corner of his home. He was to speak to the spirit respectfully, addressing it as May, Mother, and asking for its help with specific intentions, wealth, protection, success in business. He was never to let anyone else touch the oil, never to show it to others, and never, under any circumstances, to treat it as a mere object. The spirit within was a woman, Prasert said, a young woman, who had died in childbirth, her soul trapped between worlds because she had been denied the proper funeral rites. She was lonely and angry, but she could also be generous if treated well. Niran nodded, memorizing every word, and Prasert handed him the vial, along with a small cloth pouch to carry it in. As Niran stood to leave, Prasert grabbed his wrist, his grip surprisingly strong, and looked him in the eye. He said that Niran should remember that the oil was not a gift, it was a loan, and the spirit would expect repayment in the form of devotion and respect, and if Niran ever wanted to be free of it, he would have to return to Prasert to perform the proper release ritual. Niran agreed, thanked him, and left the house, the vial heavy in his pocket despite its size. The changes began almost immediately, subtle at first, then undeniable. Within a week, Niran received a call from an old client who wanted to revive a project they had abandoned years ago, and the contract was worth more than Niran had made in the past 6 months. His wife's attitude softened, the tension between them easing, and his daughter, who had been distant and sullen, started laughing again. Niran followed Prasert's instructions carefully, setting up a small altar in the corner of his bedroom, hidden behind a curtain, where he made his weekly offerings and spoke to the spirit in the oil, thanking it for its help, asking for continued protection. He felt foolish at first, talking to an empty room, but after a few weeks, the ritual became comforting, almost meditative. Business continued to improve. Doors that had been closed for years suddenly opened, and Niran found himself negotiating deals that should have been impossible. He moved his family into a larger house, paid off his debts, and even bought a new car. His wife asked him how things had turned around so quickly, and he told her it was luck, hard work, better planning, and she seemed to believe him, though sometimes he caught her, watching him with a puzzled expression, as if she sensed something had changed but couldn't articulate what. Niren kept the oil with him always, tucked into the inner pocket of his jacket, and he made sure to follow every rule Prazert had laid out. But as the months passed, and his success grew, a small, dangerous thought began to take root in his mind. The thought that perhaps he didn't need to be so careful, that perhaps the spirit was more dependent on him than he was on it. He started to skip the offerings occasionally, telling himself he was too busy, too tired, that one missed week wouldn't matter. He stopped speaking to the spirit with the same reverence, his words becoming perfunctory, rushed, and he began to ignore the small, unsettling signs that something was wrong. The first sign was a dream, or rather, the same dream repeated every night for a week. Niren would find himself standing in a dark room, the air cold and damp, and he would hear a woman's voice calling his name, soft at first, then louder, more insistent, until it became a scream. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, but he dismissed it as stress, the result of working too hard. The second sign was harder to ignore. He began to see a woman in his peripheral vision, always just out of focus, standing in doorways or at the edge of rooms watching him. When he turned to look directly, she was never there, but the sense of being observed grew stronger, oppressive. His wife mentioned seeing a strange woman near their house one evening, standing by the gate, staring up at the windows, but when she went outside to check, the woman had vanished. Niren's daughter started having nightmares, waking up, crying, and saying that someone was in her room, a lady with long black hair who smelled like flowers and something rotten. Niren tried to reassure them, telling them it was nothing, but he knew, deep down, that he had made a mistake, that he had broken the unspoken contract with the spirit. In the oil, he resumed the offerings, more elaborate this time, adding wine and sweets, and he spoke to the spirit with genuine apology, begging for forgiveness. But the disturbances did not stop. They intensified. Objects in the house began to move on their own, pictures falling off walls, doors slamming shut in the middle of the night. The smell of rotting flowers filled certain rooms, so strong it made Niren gag, and no amount of cleaning could remove it. His business, which had been thriving, suddenly hit obstacles. Clients backing out of deals at the last minute, payments delayed, contracts falling through. Niren felt the walls closing in, the same suffocating pressure he had felt before he met Prazert, only worse now, because he knew the source. He decided to return to Prazert to ask for help, to perform the release ritual and be done with the oil. But when he went back to the alley in the old district, he found the house empty, the door hanging open, the interior stripped, bare. The neighbors told him that Prazert had died 2 months ago, suddenly and without warning, and no one knew where his belongings had gone or if he had any family. Niren stood in the empty house, the vial of oil still in his pocket, and felt a wave of panic wash over him. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to appease the spirit or how to break free of it, and he realized that he was trapped, bound to something he no longer controlled. That night, the woman appeared to him not in a dream but in the flesh, standing at the foot of his bed, her features blurred and indistinct, her dress soaked and dripping with something dark. She didn't speak, but Niren heard her voice in his head, a low, angry whisper that said he had betrayed her, used her, and now she would take back what was owed. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, his throat constricted, his body frozen. The woman reached out toward him, her hand passing through his chest, and he felt a cold, searing pain, as if something inside him was being ripped away. His wife woke up beside him, shaking him, asking what was wrong, and the woman vanished, but the pain remained, a dull, throbbing ache that spread through his ribs and settled in his heart. Over the following days, Niran's health deteriorated rapidly. He grew pale and gaunt, his energy draining away, and he could barely get out of bed. Doctors found nothing wrong with him. No illness, no infection, just a steady, inexplicable decline. His wife was frantic, his daughter terrified, and Niran knew that the spirit was feeding on him, draining his life force, the way he had drained her power for his own gain. He tried everything he could think of, visiting temples, consulting monks, seeking out other practitioners of magic, but none of them could help him, or perhaps they simply refused, sensing the depth of the curse he had brought upon himself. In the end, Niran made a desperate decision. He took the vial of oil, drove out to a remote temple in the mountains, and begged the abbot for help. The abbot was an old man, older even than Prasert had been, and he listened to Niran's story with a somber expression. He agreed to try a purification ritual, a powerful ceremony that would attempt to sever the connection between Niran and the spirit, but he warned that there was no guarantee it would work and that the spirit might resist violently. The ritual took place at dawn, Niran kneeling on the temple floor surrounded by monks who chanted in low, rhythmic voices, their words blending into a sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. The abbot poured holy water over Niran's head, anointed him with sacred ash, and then took the vial of oil and smashed it against the stone floor. The liquid spread out in a thin pool, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the air grew cold, the candles flickered, and Niran heard the woman's voice again, louder now, furious, screaming words he couldn't understand. The monks chanted louder, their voices rising, and the abbot pressed a blessed amulet against Niran's forehead, the metal hot against his skin. The screaming reached a crescendo, and then suddenly it stopped. The air returned to normal, the candles steadied, and the oppressive presence that had been suffocating Niran lifted, gone as abruptly as it had arrived. Niran collapsed, gasping for breath, his body weak, but his mind clear for the first time in weeks. The abbot helped him to his feet and told him that the spirit had been released, sent on to the next life, but that Niran would carry the scar of this experience forever, a reminder of the danger of using the dead for personal gain. Niran returned to his family, and slowly, over months, his health improved, though he never fully recovered the vitality he had lost. His business stabilized, but never reached the heights it had during the time he carried the oil, and he was grateful for that, understanding now that such success had come at a price he could never truly afford. He never spoke of what had happened, not to his wife, not to his friends, carrying the knowledge alone like a weight he could not put down. But sometimes, late at night, he would wake up and feel a presence in the room, not malevolent, not anymore, but watching, waiting, and he would lie awake until dawn, wondering if the spirit had truly been freed, or if some part of her remained, bound not to the oil but to him, a shadow he could never fully escape. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem unbelievable, what comes next takes horror to a darker and more mysterious level. Because in the next part, the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying. The spirits we've encountered so far were bound by rituals, by choices made in desperation or greed. But the next tales reveal forces that require no invitation, no transaction. They simply exist, patient and eternal, waiting for the moment when the living cross invisible boundaries they never knew were there. What follows are stories of places and objects that should never be disturbed, and the devastating consequences when curiosity or ignorance leads someone to break rules older than memory itself. Molly didn't believe in spirits until the night she woke up ravenous, her stomach aching with a hunger so intense it felt like her insides were being clawed apart. And when she stumbled to the kitchen and tore through the refrigerator, eating raw meat with her bare hands, she knew something had entered her, something that was not satisfied with ordinary food. She remembered fragments of the previous evening, a visit to her aunt's village in Eisen, a gathering where old women sat in a circle chanting under the full moon, and a moment when one of them had looked at her with eyes that seemed to see straight through her skin. Malay had laughed it off, dismissed it as rural superstition. But now, standing in her kitchen with blood on her fingers and a craving that went deeper than hunger, deeper than anything physical, she understood that she had been marked. The thing inside her whispered in a voice that was not quite sound, not quite thought, telling her that it needed more, that the meat in her refrigerator was insufficient, that what it truly desired was still warm, still living. Malay dropped the package of beef she had been holding and backed away from the counter, her hands trembling, and she felt the presence shift inside her chest, coiling around her ribs like a serpent made of ice and appetite. Malay had gone to the village because her aunt was dying, and the family had gathered to pay their respects and help with the preparations for what everyone knew would be the end. Her aunt had been a respected woman in the community, known for her knowledge of herbal medicine and her ability to mediate disputes, but she had also been involved in practices that made some of the neighbors uneasy, consultations with spirit doctors, participation in rituals that predated Buddhism, and a reputation for being able to curse those who wronged her. Malay had never taken these stories seriously, viewing them as the kind of folklore that persisted in rural areas where education was limited and modernity had not fully taken hold. She worked in Bangkok as a lawyer, lived in a high-rise apartment, and considered herself rational, skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by science or law. But her mother had insisted she come, saying that it was important for the family to be together, and Malay had reluctantly agreed, taking a few days off work to make the long drive north. The village was small, just a cluster of wooden houses surrounded by rice fields and forest, and the air was thick with the smell of cooking fires, and the forest constant drone of cicadas. Her aunt lay in bed, barely conscious, her body wasted by illness, and Molly sat with her for a while, holding her hand, feeling awkward and unsure of what to say. The old woman's eyes fluttered open once, and she looked at Malay with an expression that might have been recognition, or might have been something else, something Malay couldn't read. And then she closed them again and drifted back into sleep. That evening, after the family had eaten, Malay's mother told her that some of the village women were performing a ritual to ease her aunt's passing, to ensure that her spirit would not linger or become restless, and she asked if Malay wanted to attend. Malay had no interest in participating, but she agreed to watch, curious in the way an outsider might be curious about a ceremony from an unfamiliar culture. The women gathered in a small clearing behind the house, sitting in a circle around a fire, and they chanted in a dialect Malay didn't fully understand, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to sync with the crackling of the flames. One of the women, older than the others, her face deeply lined and her hair completely white, held a small clay figure in her hands, crude and misshapen, and she placed it in the center of the circle, sprinkling herbs and rice around it. Malay stood at the edge of the clearing, watching, and she felt a strange discomfort, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as if someone was standing too close behind her. She turned to look, but there was no one there, just the darkness of the forest and the distant lights of the village. When she turned back, the old woman was staring directly at her, and her expression was not friendly, not hostile either, but something colder, more assessing, as if she was measuring Malay and finding her wanting. The ritual continued for over an hour, and Malay grew bored and uncomfortable, the mosquitoes biting her arms and legs, the heat from the fire, making her sweat. She was about to leave when the old woman suddenly stood and walked toward her, moving with surprising speed for someone her age. She stopped inches from Malay, close enough that Malay could smell the betel nut on her breath, and she spoke in a low voice, asking Malay if she believed in the spirits. Malay hesitated, not wanting to offend, and said that she respected the traditions of the village, but that she herself did not practice them. The old woman nodded slowly, as if this was the answer she had expected, and then she reached out and touched Malay's forehead with a finger that felt like ice, tracing a symbol Malay couldn't see. She said something in the old dialect, words that sounded like a warning or a curse, and then she turned and walked back to the circle, leaving Malay standing there, confused and unsettled. Malay left the clearing shortly after, returning to the house where she tried to sleep. But her dreams were strange and vivid, filled with images of hunger and consumption, of mouths opening wide and teeth sinking into flesh. She woke up before dawn, feeling exhausted and vaguely nauseous, and she decided to leave the village earlier than planned, telling her mother she had to get back to work. The drive back to Bangkok was uneventful, and by the time she reached her apartment, she had almost convinced herself that the discomfort she felt was just a product of stress and unfamiliar surroundings. But that night, the hunger began, and with it, the creeping realization that something was very, very wrong. She tried to ignore it at first, telling herself it was just a side effect of the rich village food, or perhaps a stomach bug. But the craving grew stronger, more specific, and she found herself thinking about things that horrified her, imagining the taste of organs, the texture of muscle, the warmth of fresh blood. She went to a doctor who ran tests and found nothing abnormal, and suggested it might be psychological, perhaps anxiety, or a manifestation of grief over her aunt's impending death. Malay wanted to believe that, but she knew it wasn't true. She could feel the presence inside her, separate from her own thoughts, a second consciousness that moved through her body like a parasite. The turning point came 3 weeks after her return, when Malay woke up one morning and realized she had lost an entire night. The last thing she remembered was going to bed around 10, and now it was dawn, and she was standing in her bathroom, her clothes torn and dirty, her hands covered in scratches and bruises. There was blood under her fingernails, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw that her lips were stained dark, as if she had been eating something raw. She searched her apartment frantically, looking for evidence of what she had done, and she found it in the kitchen, the remnants of something she couldn't identify, bones and tissue that looked disturbingly human in shape, though she told herself it couldn't be. It had to be an animal, something she had bought and eaten in a fugue state. But the smell was wrong, and the texture was wrong, and Molly felt a wave of revulsion and terror so intense she vomited into the sink, retching until there was nothing left. She called in sick to work, unable to face the office, unable to trust herself around other people, and she spent the day researching online, trying to find an explanation for what was happening to her. The search led her down strange paths, through forums dedicated to paranormal experiences, through academic papers on possession and dissociative disorders, and finally, inevitably, to articles about Phai Pop, a spirit from northeastern Thailand, known for possessing humans and consuming them from the inside out. The descriptions matched her symptoms too closely to be coincidence. The insatiable hunger, the loss of time, the compulsion to eat flesh, and the gradual wasting of the host's body as the spirit fed on their organs. According to the folklore, Phi Pop was usually summoned intentionally by sorcerers seeking to curse an enemy, the spirit entering the victim through food or touch and then slowly devouring them over weeks or months, leaving them gaunt and hollow while their appetite grew ever more grotesque. The only way to expel the spirit was through an exorcism performed by someone with the knowledge and power to command it, and even then, the success was not guaranteed. Malay felt a cold dread settle over her as she read, because she knew with absolute certainty that this was what had happened to her, that the old woman in the village had cursed her, either out of malice or as some kind of test, and that the thing inside her was not going to leave on its own. She tried to fight it, locking herself in her apartment, refusing to eat, hoping that starvation would weaken the spirit. But it only made things worse. The hunger became unbearable, a physical pain that radiated through her entire body, and the presence inside her grew angry, violent, thrashing against the walls of her consciousness like a caged animal. Malay found herself standing in front of her window at night, staring down at the street below, watching people walk past, and the thing inside her whispered that it would be so easy, so simple, to go down there and take what it needed. She gripped the windowsill until her knuckles turned white, fighting the urge, but she could feel her control slipping, the boundary between herself and the spirit eroding with each passing hour. In desperation, she reached out to her mother, calling her in the middle of the night and trying to explain what was happening, though she knew how insane it sounded. Her mother listened in silence, and when Malay finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said that she had suspected something like this might happen, that the old woman in the village had a reputation for cursing those she deemed disrespectful or unworthy, and that Malay's dismissive attitude toward the ritual had likely been interpreted as an insult. Her mother said she would make some calls, that she knew of a spirit doctor in another province who specialized in dealing with phi-pop, and that Malay needed to come home immediately, before the spirit consumed her completely. Malay agreed, too frightened to argue, and she packed a small bag and drove through the night, barely able to focus on the road, her vision blurring, her hands shaking on the wheel. She made it to her mother's house just before dawn, collapsing in the doorway, and her mother helped her inside, laying her down on a mat in the main room. The spirit doctor arrived later that morning, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. He examined Malay without touching her, circling around her slowly, and then he nodded and said that yes, she was possessed, and that the spirit was strong, well-fed, and deeply embedded. He asked how long it had been, and when. Malay told him. He frowned and said that she had waited too long, that the spirit had already begun to merge with her, that removing it would be painful and dangerous, and that there was a chance it might take part of her with it when it left. The exorcism took place that night, and it was nothing like Malay had imagined from movies or books. The spirit doctor prepared a circle of salt and crushed herbs on the floor of the room, and he placed Malay in the center, binding her wrists and ankles with blessed cord to prevent her from hurting herself or others. He lit candles around the circle, their flames flickering and casting long shadows on the walls, and he began to chant, his voice low and steady, the words ancient and unfamiliar. At first, Malay felt nothing, just the discomfort of being restrained and the embarrassment of being the center of such a strange ritual. But then the presence inside her reacted, and the pain was immediate and excruciating, as if something with claws was tearing its way through her chest. She screamed, thrashing against the bindings, and the spirit doctor's voice grew louder, more forceful, commanding the spirit to leave, to release its hold and return to the void. The thing inside her resisted, roaring in a voice that came from Molly's mouth but was not hers, a sound that was half human and half animal, filled with rage and hunger. Malay felt herself splitting, her sense of self fragmenting, as the spirit tried to pull her deeper, to drown her consciousness and take full control. The spirit doctor moved closer, pressing a blessed amulet against her forehead, and the metal burned like a brand, searing her skin. But the pain was almost a relief, a sharp clarity that cut through the fog of possession. The spirit shrieked, a sound so piercing that the windows rattled, and then suddenly, violently, it tore free, ripping out of Male's body in a rush of cold air and the overwhelming stench of rot. Male convulsed, her body arching off the floor, and then she collapsed, limp and gasping, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. The spirit doctor continued chanting, his hands tracing symbols in the air, and the temperature in the room dropped, frost forming on the windows despite the summer heat. The candles flickered and went out, one by one, and in the darkness, Male heard something moving, something that scraped across the floor like dragging cloth, and then there was silence, absolute and suffocating. The spirit doctor lit a single candle, and the room was empty except for the two of them and Male's mother, who stood in the doorway, her face pale with fear. He untied Male and helped her sit up, and he told her that the spirit was gone, expelled into the forest, where it would wander until it found another host or dissipated entirely, but that she would carry the scars of its presence for the rest of her life. Male returned to Bangkok a week later, weak and hollow, her body 20 pounds lighter, her skin pale and her eyes sunken. She tried to resume her normal life, going back to work, seeing friends, pretending that nothing had happened, but the experience had changed her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She no longer felt entirely alone in her own body, as if some small fragment of the spirit had remained, a whisper at the edge of her consciousness that never quite disappeared. The hunger was gone, replaced by a revulsion toward meat that made her gag at the sight of it, and she became vegetarian by necessity, unable to stomach anything that had once been living. She avoided the village, avoided her aunt's house, and when her mother told her that the old woman who had cursed her had died shortly after the exorcism, found dead in her sleep with no apparent cause, Male felt no satisfaction, only a deep, lingering dread. She knew that there were things in the world that existed beyond reason, beyond control, and that she had been lucky to survive her encounter with one of them. But she also knew that luck could run out, that the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it was thinner than she had ever believed, and that once you crossed it, even briefly, you could never fully return. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. Yet possession is not the only way spirits impose their will on the living. Sometimes, the horror comes not from something that enters you, but from something you invite into your home, something you create with your own hands and animate with rituals you barely understand. In the villages of Southeast Asia, there are objects that blur the line between tool and curse, protections that demand a price higher than most are willing to pay. What follows is a story about one such object, a guardian that was meant to defend, but instead became a source of unending terror, a reminder that some forms of protection are more dangerous than the threats they were meant to guard against. Bunmi bought the kwai tanu from a peddler at a night market in Udon Thani, not because he believed in such things, but because his neighbor had one and seemed to be thriving in ways that made no logical sense. The neighbor's business had expanded, his children had all found good jobs, and his house had been spared during a string of burglaries that had targeted every other home on the street. When Bunmi asked him about his good fortune, the neighbor had smiled and said only that he had proper protection, and then he had nodded toward a small shrine in the corner of his living room where a dark, misshapen figure, sat surrounded by offerings. The figure was crude, barely recognizable as a buffalo, its body thick and squat, its horns twisted, and it seemed to radiate a presence that made Bunmi uncomfortable, as if it was watching him even though it had no eyes. The neighbor explained that it was a kwai tanu, a spirit effigy created from materials taken from graveyards and animated through necromantic rituals, and that it served as a guardian, protecting the household from enemies, thieves, and bad luck. But only if it was properly cared for and given regular offerings. Bunmi had laughed nervously, unsure if his neighbor was joking, but the man's expression remained serious, and he said that if Bunmi ever wanted one, he should visit the night market on the full moon and look for the peddler with the red stall. Bunmi had dismissed the conversation, but as the weeks passed and his own life seemed to spiral downward, his business struggling, his wife falling ill, his car breaking down repeatedly, he found himself thinking about the kwai tanu more and more, wondering if perhaps there was something to it after all. The night market was crowded and chaotic, filled with vendors selling everything from street food to counterfeit electronics, and Bunmi wandered through the stalls for over an hour before he found the red one tucked away in a corner near the edge of the market. The peddler was an old man, his skin dark and weathered, his hands gnarled with age, and he sat behind a table covered with strange objects, amulets, talismans, bundles of dried herbs, and several small figures that looked like the kwai tanu his neighbor had shown him. The old man looked up as Bunmi approached, and without preamble, he asked if Bunmi was there to buy protection. Bunmi hesitated, feeling foolish, and then nodded. The old man gestured to the figures on the table and said that each one was unique, crafted from earth taken from graves, mixed with ash from cremation grounds, and shaped during specific lunar phases to maximize its power. He said that a kwai tanu was not a toy or a decoration. It was a bound spirit, a guardian that would protect its owner fiercely, but that it required respect and devotion. The owner must make offerings every week, rice, incense, liquor, and sometimes meat, and must speak to the kwai tanu daily, treating it as a member of the household. If these conditions were met, the kwai tanu would bring prosperity and safety. But if they were neglected, if the owner grew lazy or disrespectful, the kwai tanu would turn on them, and the consequences would be severe. Bunmi asked what kind of consequences, and the old man's expression darkened. He said that a neglected kwai tanu became violent, that it would haunt the household, breaking objects, causing accidents, and eventually harming the owner and their family, sometimes fatally. He said that once a kwai tanu turned, it was nearly impossible to appease, and that the only solution was to return it to him for a proper sealing ritual, which was expensive and not always successful. Bunmi listened to all of this, half convinced that the old man was simply a skilled salesman, and then he asked the price. The old man quoted a sum that was more than Bunmi had expected, but still within reach. And after a moment of internal debate, Bunmi agreed and chose one of the figures, a particularly ugly specimen with asymmetrical horns and a crooked snout. The old man wrapped it carefully in red cloth and handed it to Bunmi, along with a handwritten list of instructions for care and offerings. And then he looked Bunmi in the eye and said that he hoped Bunmi understood the commitment he was making, that this was not something to be taken lightly. Bunmi assured him that he did, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true, and he left the market with the bundle tucked under his arm, feeling both excited and uneasy. He set up a shrine for the kwai tanu in a corner of his living room, placing it on a small table with a bowl of rice, 3 sticks of incense, and a shot glass of whiskey, following the instructions the old man had provided. He felt absurd, performing the ritual, speaking to an inanimate object as if it could hear him, but he did it anyway, telling the kwai tanu that he was its owner now, that he would care for it and honor it, and in return, he asked for protection and prosperity. Nothing happened, of course, no dramatic flash of light or sudden sense of presence, and Boonmi went to bed that night feeling like he had wasted his money on an elaborate scam. But over the next few weeks, things began to change in ways that were subtle at first, then undeniable. His business, which had been on the verge of collapse, suddenly received a large order from a new client, a contract that kept him afloat and even allowed him to hire an additional worker. His wife's illness, which had resisted treatment for months, began to improve, her strength returning and her pain diminishing. And the string of bad luck that had plagued him, the car breakdowns, the plumbing problems, the endless small disasters, simply stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch. Boonmi was cautiously optimistic, telling himself it was just coincidence, but he continued to make the weekly offerings and speak to the kwai tanu, unwilling to risk breaking whatever pattern had brought this turnaround. His neighbor noticed the change and asked if Boonmi had taken his advice, and when Boonmi admitted that he had, the neighbor smiled and said that he had made a wise choice, that the kwai tanu was powerful and effective as long as it was respected. Boonmi agreed, and for a time, everything seemed perfect, his life stabilizing, his family happy, his future looking brighter than it had in years. The problems began 6 months later, not because Boonmi intentionally neglected the kwai tanu, but because life became busy and the rituals started to feel like a chore rather than a necessity. He began to skip the offerings occasionally, telling himself that once or twice wouldn't matter, that the kwai tanu would understand. He stopped speaking to it daily, reducing his interactions to a quick nod in the morning as he left for work. And he moved the shrine to a less prominent location, tucking it into a corner behind a potted plant, out of sight and out of mind. At first, nothing seemed to change. His luck held. His business continued to thrive. And he thought perhaps the warnings had been exaggerated, that the kwai tanu was more forgiving than the old man had suggested. But then, small things began to go wrong. Objects in the house started to break for no apparent reason, glasses shattering on the counter, picture frames falling off walls, light bulbs burning out the moment they were replaced. Boonmi chalked it up to coincidence, age, poor quality, anything but the kwai tanu. Then the accidents started. His wife tripped on the stairs and sprained her ankle badly, an injury that required weeks of recovery. His son fell off his bicycle and broke his arm. Boonmi himself cut his hand severely while preparing dinner, the knife slipping and slicing deep into his palm, requiring stitches. And through it all, he felt a presence in the house, a heaviness in the air that made it difficult to breathe, a sense of being watched by something angry and impatient. He tried to resume the offerings, to speak to the kwai tanu again, but the rituals felt hollow now, performative, and he wasn't sure if the spirit was even listening. His wife asked him what was wrong, why the house felt so oppressive, and he didn't know how to explain, didn't want to admit that he had invited something into their home that he no longer controlled. The breaking point came one night when Boonmi woke up to the sound of something moving in the living room, a heavy dragging sound followed by a loud crash. He got out of bed and crept to the doorway, peering into the darkness, and he saw the kwai tanu, no longer on its shrine but standing in the middle of the floor, its squat form somehow larger than it should be, more solid, more real. It turned toward him, and though it had no eyes, Boonmi felt its gaze, cold and accusing, and he knew that it was no longer a protector but a threat. The haunting intensified over the following days, the kwai tanu appearing in different locations throughout the house, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes in the bedroom, always facing toward Boonmi, as if waiting for something. The offerings he left went untouched, the rice rotting in the bowl, the incense refusing to light. His wife and children complained of nightmares, visions of a dark figure standing over their beds, breathing heavily, its presence suffocating. Boonmi's business began to suffer again, clients canceling orders, payments delayed, accidents happening at the shop that cost him time and money. He realized that the kwai tanu was punishing him, that it had turned as the old man had warned, and that he needed to do something before the situation escalated further. He considered destroying the figure, smashing it or burning it, but he remembered the old man's warnings that this would only make things worse, that a destroyed kwai tanu would unleash its full fury, unbound and uncontrollable. Instead, he decided to return to the night market and find the peddler, to beg him to perform the sealing ritual and take the kwai tanu back. But when Boonmi returned to the market on the next full moon, the red stall was gone, and none of the other vendors knew who he was talking about or where the old man might have gone. Desperate, Boonmi sought out his neighbor, asking for advice, and the neighbor listened to his story with a grave expression. He said that Boonmi had made a critical mistake, that once a kwai tanu turned, it was almost impossible to appease without expert help, and that the old man who sold them rarely stayed in one place for long, moving from town to town, leaving his customers to deal with the consequences on their own. He suggested that Boonmi consult a monk or a spirit doctor, someone with the knowledge to contain or expel the kwai tanu, but he warned that such services were expensive and not always effective, especially if the spirit was deeply entrenched. Boonmi visited 3 different monks, and all 3 refused to help once they learned what he was dealing with, saying that kwai tanu were dangerous and unpredictable, and that interfering with one could bring harm to them as well. Finally, he found a spirit doctor willing to attempt an exorcism, an old woman who lived on the outskirts of the city, her house surrounded by protective charms and talismans. She agreed to come to Boonmi's home, but she charged a fee that nearly bankrupted him, and she made no promises of success. The ritual took place on a night when the moon was dark, the house silent except for the low murmur of the spirit doctor's chants. She had instructed Boonmi to move the kwai tanu back to its original shrine and to surround it with offerings, not as appeasement, but as a distraction, something to occupy the spirit while she worked. She drew a circle of blessed chalk around the shrine and placed candles at each cardinal point, their flames burning bright, despite the lack of wind. She began to chant, her voice rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the walls themselves, and the air in the room grew thick and oppressive. The kwai tanu remained motionless on the shrine, but Boonmi could feel its attention, its anger radiating outward like heat from a fire. The spirit doctor's chanting grew louder, more insistent, and she reached into a bag she had brought with her, pulling out handfuls of salt and ash which she threw at the kwai tanu, the particles clinging to its surface. The figure shuddered, a barely perceptible movement, and then it began to glow faintly, a dull red light emanating from within the clay. The spirit doctor stepped back, her expression tense, and she commanded the spirit to release its hold, to return to the earth from which it had been formed. The kwai tanu resisted, the glow intensifying, and the temperature in the room plummeted, frost forming on the windows and the candles flickering wildly. Boonmi watched in terror as the figure seemed to expand, its shape distorting, becoming less like a buffalo and more like something else, something larger and more primal. The spirit doctor's voice grew strained, her chanting stumbling, and for a moment Boonmi thought she was going to fail, that the kwai tanu was too strong, too angry to be contained. But then she pulled out a final tool, a small knife with a blade inscribed with symbols, and she drove it into the ground at the center of the chalk circle. the blade sinking deep into the floor. The kwai tanu let out a sound, not audible, but felt, a vibration that rattled Boonmi's bones, and then the glow faded, the figure collapsing in on itself, crumbling into dust and ash that scattered across the shrine. The spirit doctor collapsed as well, gasping for breath, and she told Boonmi that the spirit was contained, bound to the knife and the earth, but that the house would never be entirely free of its presence, that a shadow of it would remain, a reminder of what he had invited in. Boonmi swept up the remains of the kwai tanu and buried them in his backyard, far from the house, and he left the knife embedded in the floor, covering it with a rug as the spirit doctor had instructed. The oppressive presence in the house faded, though it never disappeared entirely, and his family slowly recovered from the trauma of the haunting. His business stabilized again, though it never reached the heights it had during the kwai tanu's protective phase, and Boonmi accepted this as the price of his mistake. He never spoke of the kwai tanu to anyone, ashamed of his greed and his negligence, and he avoided the night markets entirely, unwilling to risk encountering anything similar. His neighbor, who had thrived with his own kwai tanu, eventually suffered a similar fate, his guardian turning on him after a period of neglect, and Boonmi heard through the community that the neighbor had been hospitalized after a series of mysterious accidents that left him permanently disabled. Boonmi visited him once, and the neighbor told him, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he should have listened to the warnings more carefully, that the power of the kwai tanu was real, but so was the curse, and that the two were inseparable. Boonmi nodded, and he left the hospital knowing that he had been lucky, luckier than he deserved, but that the memory of the kwai tanu would haunt him for the rest of his life, a cold, dark presence lurking at the edges of his awareness, waiting for the moment when he might forget again. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last two stories are different from the ones that came before. They are quieter in their horror, lacking the overt violence of possession or the grotesque hunger of cursed spirits, but they are no less disturbing. In fact, they may be more unsettling precisely because they feel so plausible, so rooted in the mundane world, that their supernatural elements seem like natural extensions of reality, rather than violations of it. What follows are tales of places where the past refuses to stay buried, and objects that carry memories too terrible to fade. These are the stories that linger long after the telling ends, the ones that make you question the innocence of everyday spaces and the safety of the things you bring into your home. They remind us that horror does not always announce itself with screams and blood. Sometimes it arrives in silence, patient and inevitable, waiting for the moment when you realize that escape is no longer possible. Siraporn learned too late that some orchards are not meant to be entered, and by the time she understood the true nature of what she had taken, the curse had already begun its slow, inexorable work. She had been walking along a rural road in Chiang Rai, returning from a visit to her grandmother's village, when she noticed a grove of longan trees heavy with fruit, their branches drooping under the weight of clusters that looked perfectly ripe and utterly abandoned. The trees grew behind a low stone wall that had crumbled in places, and there was no house nearby, no sign indicating ownership or warning against trespass. Siraporn was hungry, the walk was long, and the fruit looked too good to ignore, so she climbed over the wall and picked several clusters, eating some immediately and stuffing the rest into her bag. The longans were sweet and fresh, better than any she had tasted in years, and she felt pleased with her luck as she continued her journey. But that night, back in her apartment in the city, She woke up with a fever so intense it felt like her skin was on fire, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw that her face was covered in red welts that burned and itched unbearably. She thought at first it was an allergic reaction, perhaps something in the fruit, but the symptoms were too severe, too sudden, and no amount of medication seemed to help. Siriporn had grown up hearing stories about Joe Fang, curses placed on fruit trees by farmers who were tired of thieves stealing their harvest, but she had always dismissed them as superstition, the kind of tales old people told to scare children into behaving. The practice was said to be ancient, rooted in folk magic that predated Buddhism, a way for poor farmers to protect the only wealth they had. The ritual involved burying enchanted bamboo tubes beneath the roots of the trees, tubes that had been inscribed with protective symbols and filled with a mixture of earth from a graveyard, ash from cremated remains, and sometimes hair or nail clippings from the farmer's own body. A sorcerer would perform the blessing, chanting over the tubes and binding them to the spirit of the land, creating a protective barrier that would punish anyone who took fruit without permission. The punishment varied depending on the strength of the curse and the intentions of the thief. Some would merely fall ill, others would experience a run of terrible luck, losing money or possessions, and the worst offenders, those who stole repeatedly or maliciously, might die under mysterious circumstances, their bodies found with no apparent cause of death, but marked by strange symptoms that doctors could not explain. The curses were indiscriminate, affecting not just deliberate thieves but also accidental trespassers, anyone who ate the fruit or even touched the trees without the owner's consent. Siriporn had laughed at these stories when she was younger, viewing them as relics of a time when people had no understanding of medicine or chance. But now, lying in bed with her body burning and her mind racing, she began to wonder if, perhaps, there was some truth to them after all. She tried to remember if she had seen any signs near the orchard, any indication that the trees were protected, but her memory was hazy, clouded by fever, and she couldn't be certain. She called her grandmother, hoping for reassurance, and when she described what had happened, her grandmother's voice went quiet for a long moment before she spoke. She asked Siriporn exactly where the orchard had been, and when Siriporn described the location, her grandmother let out a sound that was half sigh, half groan, and she said that Siriporn had made a terrible mistake, that those trees belonged to a family known for their use of jofang, that everyone in the area knew to avoid that land, and that the curses placed there were particularly strong because the family had lost so much to thieves over the generations. The fever lasted for 3 days, during which Siriporn could barely leave her bed, her body alternating between burning heat and violent chills, her dreams filled with images of trees with roots that reached down into darkness, grasping at something she couldn't see. When the fever finally broke, she felt weak and hollow, as if something had been drained from her, and the welts on her face had faded to faint scars that itched when she was stressed or tired. She thought the worst was over, that she had paid her price and could move on, but the curse had only just begun. Within a week, she lost her job, her supervisor citing budget cuts and poor performance, though Siriporn had received excellent reviews just a month earlier. Her car broke down on the highway, the engine seizing without warning, and the repair costs were so high she couldn't afford to fix it. Her landlord informed her that the building was being sold, and she would need to move out within 30 days. And through it all, she had the persistent feeling that she was being watched, that something unseen was following her, observing her misfortunes with satisfaction. She went to a temple and made merit, donating money and offering prayers, hoping that good karma would counteract whatever curse was affecting her, but nothing changed. She consulted a doctor about her lingering symptoms, the fatigue and the scars, and the doctor found nothing wrong, suggesting it was stress or perhaps a mild autoimmune disorder that would resolve on its own. But Siriporn knew it wasn't stress. She could feel the curse working through her life like rot spreading through wood, invisible but inexorable. Her grandmother called again and told her that she needed to make amends, that the only way to break a Zhou Fang curse was to return to the orchard, to offer compensation for what had been taken, and to ask forgiveness from the spirits that guarded the land. Siriporn balked at the idea, not wanting to believe that such a thing was necessary. But as her situation continued to deteriorate, as her savings dwindled and her health declined, she realized she had no other choice. She made the long trip back to Chiang Rai, this time bringing offerings, as her grandmother had instructed, a basket of fresh fruit, a bottle of expensive liquor, incense, candles, and a sum of money folded into a red envelope. She found the orchard again, though it took longer than she expected, the road seeming different in daylight, less familiar, and when she finally located the crumbled stone wall, she hesitated, fear gripping her chest. The trees looked different now, less inviting, their branches twisted and gnarled, and the ground beneath them was bare and hard, as if nothing had grown there in years. She climbed over the wall, her hands shaking, and she walked to the center of the grove, where the oldest tree stood, its trunk thick and scarred with age. She placed the offerings at the base of the tree, arranging them carefully, and she lit the incense and candles, the smoke rising in thin trails that seemed to hang in the air without dispersing. She knelt on the ground, her knees sinking into the hard earth, and she spoke aloud, apologizing for taking the fruit, explaining that she had not known the land was protected, that she had meant no disrespect. She asked for forgiveness, offering the money as compensation, and she promised never to return, never to take anything without permission again. The air was still, oppressively so, and Siriporn felt a pressure building around her, as if the grove itself was listening, weighing her words. She stayed there for what felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes, and then she felt the pressure release, a sudden lightness that made her gasp. The incense smoke began to move again, drifting lazily upward, and the candles burned steadier, their flames no longer flickering. Siriporn took this as a sign that her offering had been accepted, and she stood, bowing deeply to the tree, and then she left the orchard, climbing back over the wall without looking back. She felt exhausted but relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, and she drove back to the city with a fragile hope that perhaps the curse had been broken. But the relief was short-lived, because although some of her immediate problems eased, her luck improving slightly, her health stabilizing, the deeper damage remained. She found a new job, but it paid less than her previous one, and the work was grueling and unfulfilling. She found a new apartment, but it was smaller and in a worse neighborhood, and she could barely afford the rent. The scars on her face never fully faded, and people stared at them, asking what had happened, and she had no answer that wouldn't sound insane. She felt marked, as if the curse had left a permanent imprint on her, a reminder that she had crossed a boundary she should never have crossed. Her grandmother told her that this was the nature of Zhou Fang, that even when the curse was lifted, it left scars, both physical and spiritual, that some transgressions could be forgiven but never fully erased. Siriporn asked if there was anything more she could do, any way to completely remove the stain, and her grandmother said that time might help, that if she lived a good life, made merit regularly, and never again took what wasn't hers, the effects would gradually diminish, but that she would always carry a shadow of the curse, a vulnerability that would make her more susceptible to bad luck and misfortune than others. Siriporn accepted this, understanding that she had no choice, and she tried to move forward, to rebuild her life piece by piece. She became more cautious, more respectful of boundaries, both physical and spiritual, and she never again took fruit from an unmarked tree, never again entered a place without knowing who it belonged to. She told her story to a few close friends, warning them about the dangers of Jiufang, but most of them laughed or looked uncomfortable, clearly thinking she had overreacted to a coincidence, and she learned to keep her experience to herself. She returned to her grandmother's village once more, years later, and she asked if the family that owned the orchard was still there, still protecting their land with curses. Her grandmother said that the family had died out, the last member passing away the previous year, and that the orchard had been abandoned, the trees left to grow wild and untended. Siraporn asked what would happen to the curses, whether they would fade now that the family was gone, and her grandmother shook her head. She said that curses like Jiufang didn't need their creators to sustain them, that once they were bound to the land, they became part of it, self-sustaining and eternal, waiting patiently for the next person who would forget or ignore the warnings. Siraporn thought about the orchard often after that, imagining it growing wilder with each passing year, the trees tangled and overgrown, the fruit rotting on the branches because no one dared to pick it. She wondered how many others had stumbled upon it, hungry or curious, and how many of them were now living with the consequences, marked and scarred like her, carrying the weight of a curse they didn't understand and couldn't escape. She considered going back one final time to see the orchard in its abandoned state, but she knew that would be foolish, that even acknowledging the place gave it power, and that the safest thing she could do was forget it existed. But forgetting was impossible. The memory was too vivid, too painful, and it surfaced whenever she saw fruit hanging from trees by the roadside, whenever she passed an orchard or a farm, whenever she felt that familiar prickling sensation on her skin that told her something was watching, waiting. She learned to live with it, the way one learns to live with any chronic condition, accepting it as part of her reality, a lesson learned the hard way about the dangers of taking what isn't freely given. And she made sure to teach her own children, when they were old enough to understand, that the world was full of invisible boundaries, protections placed by people who had been hurt too many times, and that the wisest thing one could do was to respect those boundaries, to ask before taking, to leave things alone when ownership was unclear. Her children listened with the polite skepticism of the young, nodding but not truly believing, and Siraporn saw in their eyes the same dismissive attitude she had once held, and she knew that some lessons could only be learned through experience, and she prayed that they would never have to learn this one the way she had. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And now we come to the final story, perhaps the most disturbing of all, because it involves not just the dead, but the innocent dead, those who never had a chance to live. In some corners of Asia, there exists a practice so dark that even those who engage in it speak of it only in whispers, a ritual that binds the spirit of an unborn child to an object, creating a guardian that is both powerful and tragic. These are not the ancient curses of forgotten orchards or the hungry spirits of possessed bodies, but something more intimate, more personal, something that is invited into the home and treated as family, until the moment it decides that family is no longer enough. This is a story about the kuman thong, the golden child, and about the terrible price of seeking protection from something that should never have existed in the first place. Anong bought the kuman thong from a seller on the internet, a decision she would regret for the rest of her life, though at the time it seemed like a reasonable solution to problems that had become overwhelming. She was a single mother living in Bangkok, working 2 jobs to support her young son, and no matter how hard she tried, she could never seem to get ahead. The rent was always due, the bills always piling up, and her son's school fees kept increasing. She had heard about kuman thong from a coworker who swore by hers, claiming that since she had brought it into her home, her finances had improved, her health had stabilized, and even her difficult mother-in-law had become more manageable. The coworker explained that a kuman thong was a spirit child housed in a small statue or doll, created through ancient rituals that involve the remains or essence of an unborn infant, usually one who had died tragically or been stillborn. The spirit, if treated properly with daily offerings and respect, would act as a guardian and bring luck. But the coworker was quick to add that kuman thong required constant care and could be temperamental if neglected. Anong was skeptical but desperate, and when she saw an advertisement online for a seller who claimed to create authentic kuman thong blessed by monks, she decided to take the chance. The price was steep, but the seller offered payment plans, and the reviews, though impossible to verify, were glowing. She placed the order, and 2 weeks later, a package arrived at her door, wrapped in layers of red cloth and smelling faintly of incense. The kuman thong was smaller than she expected, a figure no more than 6 inches tall, carved from dark wood and painted gold, with the face of a child, serene and innocent. The seller had included detailed instructions for care, daily offerings of toys, sweets, and a glass of a red-colored drink, usually a sugary beverage that resembled blood, along with regular prayers and conversations with the spirit, treating it as if it were a living member of the household. Anong set up a small shrine in the corner of her living room, placing the kuman thong on a shelf with offerings arranged around it, and she began the daily rituals, speaking to the spirit in a soft voice, asking for its help and protection. She felt foolish at first, talking to a wooden figure as if it could hear her, but her coworker had emphasized the importance of belief, saying that the spirit could sense sincerity and would respond accordingly. Anong's son was curious about the new addition to their home, asking what it was, and she told him it was a special guardian spirit that would watch over them, and he seemed to accept this, occasionally waving at the figure or leaving one of his toys beside it as an offering. The first signs of change came within a month, subtle improvements that Anong might have dismissed as coincidence if not for the timing. She received an unexpected bonus at work, a small amount but enough to cover the overdue electric bill. Her son's teacher called to say that he had been doing exceptionally well in class, his grades improving dramatically. And Anong herself felt healthier, more energetic, as if a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. She continued the rituals faithfully, grateful for the help, and she even began to feel a strange affection for the kuman thong, the way one might feel toward a pet or a protective younger sibling. Her coworker noticed the change in her demeanor and asked if the kuman thong was working, and Anong admitted that it seemed to be, that things were definitely better than they had been before. But caring for the kuman thong was more demanding than Anong had anticipated, and as the months passed, the daily rituals began to feel less like acts of devotion and more like obligations. She started to resent the time it took, the money spent on offerings, the need to maintain a constant level of attention and respect. She began to skip days, telling herself that one missed offering wouldn't matter, and when nothing immediately bad happened, she grew more lax, reducing her prayers to quick, perfunctory words spoken without real feeling. Her son, too, lost interest in the figure, ignoring it as children do when novelty wears off, and Anong moved the shrine to a less prominent location, tucking it into a corner of the hallway where it was out of the way. She didn't notice the shift at first, the way the air in her apartment grew heavier, the way shadows seemed darker in certain rooms, or the way her son started having nightmares, waking up, crying, and saying that someone was standing by his bed, watching him. Anong dismissed these as typical childhood fears, the result of too much screen time or stories shared at school, and she didn't connect them to the kuman thong until the incidents became impossible to ignore. Objects in the apartment began to move, small things at first, keys disappearing and reappearing in strange places, books falling off shelves, the television turning on by itself in the middle of the night. Anong checked the locks on her doors and windows, thinking perhaps someone was breaking in, but everything was secure, and there was no sign of intrusion. Her son's nightmares intensified, and he started to describe the figure he saw, a child with a golden face and dark eyes that didn't blink, standing silently at the foot of his bed. Anong felt a chill when she heard this, because the description matched the kuman thong exactly, and she realized with growing dread that the spirit was no longer content to remain on its shelf, that it was wandering the apartment, and that its presence was anything but benign. She tried to resume the rituals, to appease the spirit with renewed offerings and apologies, but the disturbances only escalated. The kuman thong appeared to her in dreams, no longer serene but angry, its painted mouth twisted into something that might have been a grimace or a scream. She woke up with scratches on her arms, thin red lines that stung and bled, though she had no memory of how they got there. Her son refused to sleep in his own bed, insisting on staying with her, and even then, he would wake up multiple times a night, terrified and crying. Anong's finances, which had improved so dramatically after she brought the kuman thong home, began to collapse again, worse than before. She was fired from one of her jobs for reasons that made no sense, accused of theft she hadn't committed, and her other employer cut her hours without explanation. Bills she thought she had paid were returned as unpaid, late fees piling up, and her bank account was mysteriously drained by charges she didn't recognize and couldn't dispute. She felt as if she was being punished, targeted by a force that was both petty and relentless. And she knew it was the kuman thong, angry at her neglect, taking back everything it had given and more. She contacted the seller, hoping for guidance, but the email address no longer worked, and the website where she had made the purchase had been taken down. She searched online for information about how to appease or dispose of a kuman thong, and the results were terrifying. Stories of people who had tried to throw theirs away only to have it return, of families driven from their homes by violent hauntings, of mental breakdowns and unexplained deaths. One forum post suggested returning the kuman thong to a temple where monks could perform a ritual to release the spirit, but others warned that not all temples would accept such items and that some spirits were too bound to be released, trapped in the objects that housed them. Anong felt trapped herself, caught in a situation she had created but couldn't control, and she didn't know what to do. The breaking point came when her son disappeared one evening, simply vanishing from the apartment while she was in the next room. Anong searched frantically, calling his name, checking every corner, and she found him 20 minutes later in the hallway closet, curled into a ball and sobbing uncontrollably. He said the golden child had taken him, had pulled him into the closet and held him there, whispering things he couldn't understand, and Anong saw in his eyes a terror that no child should ever experience. She grabbed the kuman thong from its shelf, her hands shaking with rage and fear, and she considered smashing it, burning it, anything to make it stop. But something held her back, a voice in her head that sounded like her coworkers, warning her that destroying a kuman thong was the worst thing she could do, that it would unleash the spirit completely, unbound and vengeful. Instead, she wrapped it in cloth, shoved it into a bag, and drove across the city to a temple she had heard about, one that specialized in dealing with haunted objects and cursed items. She arrived late at night, the temple grounds dark and empty, and she left the bag at the base of the main shrine, along with an envelope containing all the money she had left, and a note begging the monks to help her, to take the kuman thong and do whatever was necessary to release or contain the spirit. She didn't wait for a response, couldn't bear to, and she drove back to her apartment, her son silent in the back seat, both of them shaken and exhausted. For the next few days, Anong lived in a state of constant anxiety, waiting for the kuman thong to return, for the spirit to come back and finish what it had started. But slowly, gradually, the oppressive atmosphere in the apartment began to lift. Her son's nightmares stopped. The objects in the apartment stayed where they were supposed to be, and the scratches on Anong's arms began to heal. She didn't know if the monks had successfully released the spirit, or if they had simply contained it in a place where it could do no more harm, and she was afraid to contact the temple to find out, afraid that any acknowledgement might reopen the connection. Anong never fully recovered from the experience, and neither did her son. He grew up wary and anxious, flinching at unexpected sounds, refusing to sleep with the lights off, even as a teenager. Anong's financial situation stabilized eventually, but it took years of hard work and sacrifice, and she never again sought shortcuts or supernatural solutions to her problems. She told her story to a few friends, hoping to warn them away from making the same mistake, but most of them dismissed it as superstition or mental illness, a stress-induced breakdown that had been misinterpreted as a haunting. Only her coworker, the one who had first told her about kuman thong, listened with a grave expression, and she admitted that her own kuman thong had become difficult recently, demanding more and more, and that she was considering getting rid of it, but was afraid of the consequences. Anong told her to do it, to take it to a temple before things got worse, and her coworker nodded but looked uncertain, and Anong never found out whether she followed the advice. She moved to a new apartment a year later, unable to shake the feeling that the old one was tainted, and she performed a thorough blessing ritual before bringing any of her belongings into the new space. She avoided anything related to the occult, refused invitations to spirit houses or fortune tellers, and when people asked her if she believed in ghosts or spirits, she said that she didn't, because the truth was too complicated and too painful to explain. But late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she would sometimes think about the kuman thong, wondering where it was now, whether it was still angry, whether some other desperate person had found it and brought it into their home, repeating the cycle. She thought about the spirit child that had never been born, trapped in a wooden figure and forced to serve strangers, and she felt a deep sadness mixed with her fear, because the real horror wasn't just what the kuman thong had done to her, but what had been done to create it in the first place. She wondered if the spirit had ever wanted to be a guardian, or if it had simply been bound against its will, forced into a role it couldn't escape, and she prayed, though she wasn't sure to whom or what, that someday the spirit would find peace, would be released from its wooden prison, and allowed to move on to whatever came next. But she also knew that such peace was unlikely, that the demand for kuman thong continued, that sellers like the one she had bought from were still operating, still creating new spirit children to serve the desperate and the greedy, and that somewhere, right now, another person was making the same mistake she had made, inviting something into their home that should never have existed, and learning too late that some forms of protection are more dangerous than any threat they might guard against. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.